Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Friday, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
Hey everyone, welcome to French Friday. I am joined by David French. Hi, David.
Skye, great to see you.
You too. All right, we have a lot to cover. I want to begin with a piece that you wrote a few weeks ago, or this week, called "The Trouble Began When MeToo Became ChurchToo." We'll get into that specific dynamic in a minute, but I want to talk about how the moment we're in today with the re-election of Donald Trump looks very different than the reaction to his initial election back in 2016. Folks, I'm sure recall that during that campaign, a lot of women came forward to accuse Donald Trump of inappropriate behavior. The Access Hollywood tape had come out. And so when Trump was elected, there was this outpouring of, I don't know what the right word is, grievance from women all over the country. And there were other things going on at the same time. There was the Harvey Weinstein story, numerous other stories of misogyny and abuse. And was it shortly after his inauguration that the Women's March happened in Washington?
Yeah. The women's very soon afterwards. This was the launch of, the hashtag resistance and the pink hats. We'll just call them the pink hats.
Yes.
And there was just a sense that something illegitimate had happened.
Right.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about Donald Trump, obviously. It spread throughout the culture, Hollywood, a lot of other places where stories of abuse were being brought into the light. More women were willing to come forward with stories of how they had been mistreated, sometimes horrifically. And it felt like the entire culture was having this moment of, all right, enough is enough. We're not going to allow this to continue. And the hashtag MeToo thing started. Here we are 8 years later. Donald Trump's been reelected, and we're not having that kind of second resurgence of the Women's March or the Me Too movement. Talk about what you are observing right now that looks very different from 8 years ago.
Yeah, if you just take a step back and think about it, it is pretty remarkable because you laid out the scenario 8 years ago, I think, very, very well. There was a real sense that something was changing, something very fundamental was changing about the way we looked at relationships between men and women, especially in the professional world. Mm-hmm. Well, just think about this sort of on the right in the last few months. I mean, so we had a featured speaker at the Republican National Convention who had been caught on video hitting his wife, okay? You had the finding that the Republican frontrunner for president, who is now the president-elect, there was a finding that he was liable for sexual abuse in a court in Manhattan. Now, why? That's not just important because of the fact that he was found liable for abuse. It's important because the right-wing criticism of Me Too for a long time was, hey, you guys are shunning due process. These things need to be tried in courts of law, not in the media. You had a case tried in a court of law against Trump, and that didn't even matter. You had this situation where Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has a phenomenally checkered past when it comes to women. I mean, there are reports that he had affairs with dozens of women. His ex-wife had committed suicide. Horrible, tragic. He has an inappropriate relationship with a reporter. The reporter loses her job. He becomes the HHS cabinet nominee. Pete Hegseth, 3 marriages, I believe. He settled a sexual assault claim. We don't know all the details of that. There's a non-disclosure agreement, but his defense was that he had consensual extramarital sex with a married woman. That's his defense, and he's the Secretary of Defense nominee. So we're getting to this point.
And to interject here, and whose own mother came out and called him an abuser of women.
Right.
It's not a good sign when mom's not in your corner.
No. And, we also had the nomination of Matt Gaetz to be Attorney General that was thankfully derailed, but it took evidence of sex with an underage girl to do it. I mean, so, you're talking about just an extraordinary disregard for, if you had told me at the height of Me Too that this was going to happen just a few years later, I would have been a little surprised, Skye, but it is brazen. It is brazen, sort of the rejection of any kind of moral standard.
Yeah, and again, to recount some of the history we've been through in the initial Me Too movement, you had multiple Hollywood actors, producers be taken down from their abuse. There was Charlie Rose from CBS News, lost his position because of accusations against him. Of course, we mentioned Harvey Weinstein, Roger Ailes at Fox News, Bill O'Reilly at Fox News. There was just, on all sides, there were people being taken down because of the misogyny, the abuse, the gross things that came into the light. And it felt like we're having a reckoning. But now, you mentioned all these Trump appointees and Trump himself. It seems like no one cares. It's a non-issue. And in fact, with Pete Hegseth, it seems like they've really circled the wagons, and it's likely he will be appointed.
Well, yeah, there's so many onions of awfulness to peel here, Skye, because again, if you go to the Pete Hegseth situation, his support began to flag initially after the Washington Post provided more details of the, the sexual assault claim. Again, he's denied this. There's an NDA. He may release the woman from the NDA. We may get more information, but more information comes out about his alleged drunkenness, his alleged mistreatment of women. Information comes out from his own mother. And all of a sudden, the MAGA swarm, this was a great phrase used by one of my colleagues, the MAGA swarm activates in his defense, and now he's more likely to be confirmed. And so Skye, wanted to write about this migration from 2017, where it looks like there's this fundamental change perhaps occurring, or at least some degree of change. Fundamental might be overstating it, but some degree of change to 2024. How do you get from A to B here on this?
Yeah. And I remember having conversations at the time on Holy Post and other platforms about the Me Too movement and what a Christian's response ought to be. And as a Christian who believes in the dignity of women, who believes misogyny and sexual abuse is a fundamental violation and sin against God and against others, I saw the Me Too movement as the culture embracing a more Christian ethic of equality and dignity. And at least the Christian right for many years talked about how character counts and we need to hold people accountable to these things. There was even a recalibration on the left of their defense of Bill Clinton back in the 1990s.
Right.
There was a lot of things were going on there that felt to me like this, in the midst of, we often can gloom and doom the culture, but it felt to me like this was an instance where the culture was actually moving closer to Christian values rather than away from them. But now we've gone really far the other way, where the horrific abuse of women, even being found liable by a jury for sexual abuse, is a complete non-issue for most voters when they're electing a president, let alone appointing a defense secretary or anyone else. So talk about where you think the pivot occurred. When did that momentum around Me Too shift to bring us to where we are now?
Okay, so I believe the momentum began to shift, Skye, when Me Too went from being a left-wing problem primarily. Now, early in the Me Too era, there were, Bill O'Reilly was forced out at Fox, Roger Ailes was forced out at Fox, but it's absolutely clear that early Me Too was overwhelmingly concentrated in Hollywood, establishment media, institutions that were more left-leaning institutions. And so a lot of conservatives were standing there, and I went back and I looked at some of my own early Me Too writings, and it was like, hey, the chickens of the sexual revolution are coming home to roost here. If you drain moral meaning from sexual relationships and you replace that with this sort of consent-only morality, that the only moral touchstone is consent, then perversely, ironically, you have sexualized life to such a degree that you're making these kinds of scandals inevitable. And so this was the argument. And then
and where there's a power differential between a powerful man and a less powerful woman, the consent thing gets very murky.
Very murky.
So and that gets exploited.
Exactly. And so So there was this argument, and a lot of people, quite frankly, in the Christian world, were feeling a little bit vindicated. And then Skye, it all exploded in the church. Now, I do think what began to happen is a lot of, as MeToo morphed into ChurchToo, it wasn't that we began to see what was just freshly there in the church. We began to see what was there in the church and what had been there that we had not seen. And so huge institutions, important institutions, Southern Baptist Convention, Liberty University, Ravi Zacharias Ministries, Kanakuk Camp. I mean, you can just go down the list, mega church after mega church. And so all of a sudden, that easy pat answer of, look what left-wing morality leads to, got much more complicated. And look, initially, a lot of people responded, I thought, quite well. I mean, the Southern Baptist Convention, the messengers to the convention ordered the executive committee to take action. The Southern Baptists formed a sexual abuse task force. The executive committee votes to even waive attorney-client privilege to produce this report. And then the report is produced and it's worse than anyone expected. But then you began to see the momentum, Skye, fade away. That sort of the reflexive defensiveness of our institutions began to kick in. And so fast forward a couple of years and this sex abuse task force winds up its work without completing it. You have massive, you have once again just massive evangelical support for a MAGA movement that isn't just Donald Trump is sexually corrupt. A host of people around him are, and that seems to be no problem at all. So things absolutely began to change when MeToo began to be ChurchToo, when it wasn't just a left-wing problem anymore. It was a human problem, a universal problem. And then the will to do something just collapsed.
Yeah. Maybe it's a case of misogynists who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Right. When it felt like there was a political advantage in pointing out the misogyny and sexual abuse that happened on the other side, we were eager to highlight those stories and make hay out of them. But once it turned around and we realized, oh, our side has something to lose, or our institutions have something to lose, or my political tribe has something to lose in this whole conversation, then suddenly no one wants to have the conversation anymore. And maybe another way of thinking about it is it's like a sexual misconduct Cold War where there's mutually assured destruction. So no one's going to push the button.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. But I also think there's something about evangelical culture that kind of makes this worse in a way. And here's what I mean. A lot of it is a lot of evangelical political culture. I don't want to sort of say, culture writ large, but evangelical political culture is sort of motivated by this idea that we're a virtuous community surrounded by hostile, dark forces. And so therefore it is we have to fight these hostile, dark forces to preserve this virtuous, good community. And so it's not just that there is a good versus evil construct, it's that we're good and you're evil.
Right.
And so what ChurchToo did is it really, if you had eyes to see, it absolutely sort of undermined that narrative that the alternative Christian institutions that we had built, alternative educational institutions, alternative entertainment institutions, all of these alternative institutions that were supposed to be apart from and better than the world, in some cases it's not that they weren't better, they were even worse than the world.
If I can add a layer to that, the very motivation for creating those alternative institutions was to keep Christians safe. Right. If you
That's
engage,
a good way of putting it.
If you engage the secular media, it's going to destroy your children. So we're going to create this Christian media where it's safe. If you send your kids to a regular camp, bad things could happen to them. If you send them to a Christian camp, good things will happen to them. If you send your kids young adults to a secular university, their faith will be destroyed and they'll be, drinking too much and engaging in sexually immoral behavior. So you send them to a Christian university where they'll have good moral upbringing. And so the whole premise was you're safe in this Christian subculture. Yeah. And the ChurchToo movement destroyed that illusion and said, no, actually, in some cases, you're just as likely to be abused, to be malformed, the horrible things were going on in those, and it undermined the very premise for which they existed. And that was incredibly threatening to the entire evangelical subculture.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what you began to realize was, I put it this way in an Atlantic article. It's, Christians have become comfortable saying, well, there's bad apples, right, in every orchard.
Right.
And so you could always say, well, there's bad apples. When you began to get the evidence of not just individuals who transgressed, but institutions that facilitated it and enabled it, right, then you have to ask, well, how many bad apples do you have to pluck before you get questions about the orchard? Before you get questions about sort of the way we have formed these institutions, the way we have transmitted character development within these institutions. Because look, Skye, some of the details of this stuff are just so grim. Let's take Liberty University, for example. This was a school that its president was asked to step down after just a host of scandals. But one of the things that was so tragic about it, even before all of the details of the allegations against Jerry Falwell Jr. became public, it was quite obvious that he was living a life that if a student lived it would be punished, right? So already you had the giant hypocrisy and double standards. But then you have this situation where it wasn't just that the school was protecting their powerful president who raised a lot of money. It was also suppressing and oppressing female victims of sexual assault on its campus, in some ways in this really awful way where if you had been victimized, say, at a party, they would use the fact that maybe you had a drink at the party or you're drinking at the party against you in the proceedings, right? This is if you had violated what was called the Liberty Way. And then the federal government blasted Liberty with one of the largest, if not the largest, Clery Act fines in history because it found that Liberty had systematically, for example, underreported crime on its campus, even to the point of shredding police reports. So again, that point you made, Skye, about safety, right? This is the safest campus. They were broadcasting that. Well, it turns out that they were messing with the records to distort the truth. And so, you come at this again and again, how in the interest of institutional self-preservation, women, children, boys, girls thrown under the bus, just time and time again.
So one of the points you bring up in your piece is that a lot of these institutions or even its leaders will talk a good game about justice and caring for vulnerable people and exposing and healing from abuse. But when there's an actual cost to pursuing that, tragically few institutions and leaders have been willing to pay that cost. Explain maybe in specific stories or why you think that's the case.
Well, so in the last several years, Nancy in particular, and I as well, have been really diving in and investigating a number of abuse situations and incidents. So, for example, I did quite a bit of reporting on the Ravi Zacharias, how the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries responded to allegations against Ravi Zacharias, reported that out years ago. My wife did a multi-year investigation of Kanakuk camps that I assisted her on towards the end. In addition, Nancy kind of investigated what happened with her own abuse that she's written about and went back to her old church and talked to her old pastor. And so these are just a few examples of a number of incidents that I've looked at over the last several years. And a couple of things stood out. One, early on every circumstance that I have looked at, somebody had the ability to stop the abuse without even making a significant sacrifice at all. So firing a rising star camp counselor because he was nude with young boys. How much of a sacrifice does that take, right? Like that's minimal. Yeah, he was able to raise some money. Yeah, a lot of the kids seemed to like him, but he was nude with boys. So you get rid of that person, even if, you thought that this person had promise. Like, that's the smallest sacrifice you can imagine. Or a person at a church who's an elder at a church whose son is predatory. Well, you confront the son, even if the elder at the church is going to be mad at you. That's a small thing. That's a small sacrifice. So time and time again, what you see are the failure to engage, even have that small sacrifice, take a small risk, then morphs and metastasizes over years into the point where you have serial predation. And then, something small becomes something huge, and you do something about it, or you want something to be done about it. You want systemic reform. And sort of the larger Christian community, sort of rather than kind of give up an election or give up sort of a cultural argument against the other side, even these smaller sacrifices they're not willing to make to engage in the kinds of systemic reforms. So it goes from small sacrifices personally that people won't make to small sacrifices collectively that we won't make because, and I think this is just a universal human problem, is that we are often quite interested in justice, and we're not interested in sacrifice to any degree to accomplish justice for another person.
Reminds me of, remember that Meatloaf song, "I'll do anything for love, but I won't do that." It's a little bit like, I'll do anything for justice, but I won't do that.
Right.
We talk the talk. We when it comes down to actually paying the price, we're unwilling to do it. And it feels a little bit like pulling a weed is a lot easier when it's small.
Yeah.
But the bigger it gets, the more root system it has, it's just that much harder to remove. So my concern, let's come back to the present day. My concern now is, because there's been this backlash against MeToo, or this indifference to all these things, do we actually end up in a culture that's worse than prior to MeToo? Because there's a callousness that's grown up, or an unwillingness. More institutions and leaders now know what could happen if they open the door to an abuse investigation or whatever. And so is it actually, in this current situation with the incoming Trump administration, an example of, we just don't care anymore, and it's worse than it was back, at least in the 90s when Bill Clinton's accusations came up? People cared. You could argue that it didn't have the effect it should have had, but people cared. And then it felt like in 2017, people really cared.
Yeah.
And now it's gotten even worse. We're back in the 1960s where everyone knows this is happening. No one cares. We're not even going to report on it because it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, I think the pattern there, we're going to have a pattern that's just going to persist for a while. And I do think it's worse. And that pattern is going to be, we'll take action when it's easy and we won't when it's hard. Okay. So if you have, say, a megachurch pastor who is caught up in some, sexual scandal, most megachurches will just go ahead and continue to take action. And they'll replace that pastor with somebody else. And there's no real sort of perception that there's damage to the larger evangelical project. But if there's ever a threat of damage to sort of the larger evangelical project, then people quail, they fall, they recoil from that. So, again, to go back to, say, like the Ravi Zacharias situation, by failing, by continuing to protect him for years as his star grew in magnitude and brightness, it raised the stakes of bringing him down, right? So to the point became, well, there's real damage that could be done to the kingdom, right? By if this person is held to account, there's going to be huge damage that will but what we have to say is not holding them to account is causing the damage. Holding them to account is the start of repair. The damage is being inflicted by the conduct, not by the revelation. And this is the thing that I think people forget time and time again. It's not the revelation that's so damaging. It's the conduct. That's the problem. The revelation is the beginning of the healing, the beginning of the repair, not the beginning of the crisis. The crisis has been going on for a while. And so, but again, when it's easy, people do it. Skye, they'll do it when it's easy. When there's political advantage in it, they'll do it with zeal. But if they're sacrificed, woo.
Right. I worry about the lesson that we've learned from all this. I'm thinking back to the situation with Al Franken.
Yeah.
Recall that he, for those who don't remember, he was a writer and performer on Saturday Night Live who eventually became a senator from Minnesota. And an accusation was made against him in that MeToo era. And I don't know the truth or falsehood of the accusation, but it was by far not the most terrible accusation that we heard in those days. But it was enough for him to feel pressure from the Democratic Party that he resigned his seat in the Senate. And afterwards, some people felt like he gave up too easily, like he should have fought it more. But it was, again, indicative of that moment where there was this reckoning and any form of misogyny or abuse was taken very, very seriously. Well, now we've seen with the reelection of Donald Trump and the way he has survived multiple horrific accusations, including a jury finding him liable for abuse, it sent the message that if you just dig in your heels and you're shameless about you can be, forget surviving, you can be rewarded by voters and the public and the media and all that. And it sends the message to abusers, you have carte blanche freedom to keep abusing and deny what's going on and fight it like crazy, be shameless, and you can actually come out on top. That's a horrible message to be sending to a culture where women and children are being abused with impunity.
Right. Look, I mean, I'm a big believer in due process. I've been a constitutional lawyer my entire adult life. And so, look, I understand there is such a thing as a false accusation. Not
Absolutely.
And so if innocent people should fight, right, for their innocence. But what we're talking about here isn't so much a digging in over innocence. It's a digging in to just push through actual scandal, right? So, if you're talking about the Hegseth situation, the best case situation is that, he's had 3 marriages, that he had sex out of wedlock with a married woman after one of his marriages ended. And, it's just there's a lot there that is for the Christian. If you're talking about the Christian of 1998, the argument that we had in 1998, Christians would say, oh, absolutely, we have standards that somebody like that is not, there's lots more people who've not had multiple adultery situations, but instead it's, well, the other side's worse, or or desperate times call for desperate measures. We can't, if we hold our side to these high standards, then we'll be defenseless in the culture. It's all of these kinds of arguments, ends justify the means kinds of arguments that really excuse us for not having any meaningful standards at all. What is the line now? I guess Matt Gaetz would say, well, it's evidence of sex with someone underage. That's the line. Okay.
That's a pretty low bar.
Is
that
a
pretty
it?
low bar. Yeah. A tragically low bar. Well, we'll keep our eye on this. I tend to agree with you that the Me Too movement feels like it's over, but I hope there is some ongoing positive outcome that more, maybe not on a national level, maybe not on a political level, but in our communities and institutions, there's still a lingering sensitivity to these dynamics that will end up resulting in more women and more kids being safer in more environments. I hope that's the case.
Right.
But we'll see. All right, I want to turn to another important topic that you've written about and you've covered on Advisory Opinions. You're my go-to, you and Sarah are my go-to to understand what's going on in the Supreme Court. And
love it.
There's a case that was recently argued before the Supreme Court about Tennessee's ban on transgender medical intervention for kids.
Yeah.
There are so many landmines in dealing with this topic.
It's the easiest thing to talk about in the world, Skye. Nobody has strong feelings.
No one has strong feelings, and no one has misunderstandings, and there's no cultural distortion on this topic.
And no one interprets these things in bad faith and tries to,
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to try to have a conversation with you to help us understand the specifics of this case legally, but let's lay out the basics. Explain the law in Tennessee and the challenge against it.
Yeah. So Tennessee passed a law along with around 24 other states banning medical interventions for, quote, gender or so-called gender affirming. It banned essentially so-called gender affirming medical interventions for minors. So what does that mean? As a practical matter, it means no puberty blockers. As a practical matter, it means you cannot give a boy female hormones for the purpose of gender reassignment. You can't give a girl male masculine hormones for the purpose of gender reassignment. You cannot give surgeries, cosmetic surgeries for the purpose of gender reassignment. All of these things are banned in the Tennessee law. And so the question then is this ban constitutional?
Yeah. Before we get into the constitutionality of it, I also want to clarify that this ban would apply even if the child's parents want these treatments, even if the child's doctor wants these treatments or advises these treatments. The state says you cannot do it. So it's not just a 16-year-old going to the doctor going, can I have hormone treatments or surgery? It's also their parents and the doctor themselves. The state just says, nope, this is unavailable.
Right.
Okay.
Right, exactly. So if you're a minor, you can't have it even if your parents want you to. Now, you can go to another state that allows for it and get treatment there. That's, legal, but not in the state of Tennessee. And so the question is that constitutional? Mm-hmm. And now what's interesting about this is this always happens when we have Supreme Court cases, Skye. The question before the court wasn't, should you ban it or not? Okay, that's not the question. The court was not looking at this in a blank slate saying, okay, you are now determining the wisdom of Tennessee's law. No. That's not what the court is doing. It's determining the constitutionality of the law. And
does the state of Tennessee have the constitutional right to ban these things?
Okay. And so what makes this interesting is that it's actually a little bit different case than the normal constitutional case a lot of people are used to seeing, because most cases that people follow, they implicate either what's called a fundamental right. So let's say the First Amendment, free exercise clause is a fundamental right. Free speech, fundamental right. Due process, fundamental right. Or they implicate what's called a suspect class. So in other words, a class of people that are especially protected under the law. So race is a suspect class. So that means if you create a law that has a racial distinction, that's going to be a high level of scrutiny applied to that law.
Right. So you can't pass a law in a state saying black people have to pass an exam before they're allowed to vote.
Right. So most cases you follow at the Supreme Court involve either these fundamental rights, these quote unquote culture war cases, or suspect classes. And so what we're used to is the court really diving into the law and exposing it to very exacting, tough scrutiny. Okay. That's probably not what's going to happen here. Okay. So this is something that's really interesting and a lot of people don't understand. As a general matter, if I challenge a law that is passed by a state legislature, let's just say it's a random law, as a general matter, the court is not going to give that law a very careful look. It's going to do something called rational basis review. And it's just going to say, look, the law is constitutional if it has a rational basis. In other words, is this rationally calculated to achieve the state's aims? And so the large majority of laws, if you're going to challenge them, are just subject to this rational basis review. And if you are challenging a law on rational basis review, you're going to lose. 99.9% of the time, a law can pass rational basis review. Now, here's where things get interesting, Skye. Approval of medical treatments and drugs for any given use is a function traditionally of the political branches of government. And those decisions are traditionally subject to rational basis review.
Okay.
Yeah. So in other words, walking into the court, the plaintiffs are facing this giant uphill challenge because it's not that they can come into the court and say, Tennessee should not have done it. Their main challenge is they have to make an argument that says Tennessee has no rational basis for doing this, which is a different argument. And then, so they're trying to change that standard of review. They're trying to get the court to take a closer look.
So to help us all understand this, who don't follow the legal lingo,
yeah, and I apologize.
No.
Probably was
Can you give us a hypothetical outside of the realm of transgender care and something that like the FDA would do that someone might not like, but how would the courts deal with it?
Okay, what I'm going to say now makes no medical sense. All right.
Okay.
But let's just pretend for a minute. Let's suppose there is an acne medication. You take it, it's approved for acne, and it's, fine for that, does great for that. But some doctors say, wait a minute, this acne medication actually also is remarkably effective at treating rheumatoid arthritis, we believe. And so we're going to start prescribing it for people for rheumatoid arthritis, an off-label, a use that it's not been specifically approved for. But then all of a sudden, like weird side effects start popping up that some people, it works great. Some people, it's really not good. Okay. That there's really deep damage. And so a regulator, let's say the FDA, steps in and says, wait, we are going to regulate, we're going to prohibit this other use because the side effects are horrific. And even though it provides some people with benefit, the cost-benefit analysis is just not there. So that is,
or they might say this drug was tested for the care of acne, but we don't yet have enough evidence to use it for arthritis. And until we have more data that proves it's safe and the side effects are minimal, we're not going to allow doctors to prescribe this to people with arthritis.
Exactly.
Something like that.
So in that circumstance, I generally don't have a constitutional right to that medication.
Right. So if a patient who had been using it for arthritis suddenly no longer has access to that drug and they sue the state that banned it or the FDA for banning it, a court would say, well, the FDA had a rational reason for doing this. They had a
rational basis for doing this. Right.
Too bad, so sad.
Yep.
Go home with your arthritis.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. So then let's bring it back to this case. The state of Tennessee says we are banning treatments, hormonal, surgical, whatever, for minors who want to transition in some way.
Right.
And kind of steel man the argument coming from those opposed to this ban. What are they saying to that would make this go all the way to the Supreme Court?
So here's what they're saying. They're saying that this is actually, the case began really with two big arguments. One is, wait a minute, this is not actually a normal medication decision. What this actually is sex discrimination. And sex discrimination is subject to a higher level of constitutional scrutiny, which is true.
Because sex is a protected class.
It's a protected class. Not to the same extent as race, but it is a protected class. So they said, no, this isn't actually a decision based on this is a decision that is rooted in sex discrimination. Therefore, it cannot be constitutional unless it passes what's called intermediate scrutiny. And there's enough evidence of the efficacy and also of the intentional sex-based targeting, the efficacy of the treatment, and there's enough evidence of the intentional sex-based targeting that this can't pass intermediate scrutiny. The law fails.
Would they argue that the state of Tennessee is showing malice towards transgender people? Is that the idea?
That would be part of the argument. That this is actually a discrimination. This is a discriminatory law. So
this isn't based. They would argue this is not based on evidence or science or the best interests of these children. It's malice towards a class of people, and therefore this law should be struck down.
Right. So the argument is, well, a boy can take testosterone, but a boy cannot take estrogen. A girl can take estrogen, cannot take testosterone. What's the distinction here? The distinction here is really rooted in sex. And then also they're saying it is rooted in sort of an animus towards transgender individuals. But that is as effective of an argument because transgender individuals have never been deemed a suspect class. So the class transgender individuals has not been, in essence, constitutionalized for extra protection, if that makes sense. And so then the other argument that they made was, okay, this is not just sex discrimination, it's also interference with parents' rights.
Which is an argument you've made in other cases and gotten a lot of heat for.
Yeah. So the argument that I've made is that states cannot punish parents for seeking legal treatment for their children. So in other words, if I am a parent in Texas and I go to, I don't know, Massachusetts for kind of medical treatment for my kids, that's not grounds for Texas to remove my children from my custody. That my parental rights include the right to seek legal treatment for my children. My parental rights have not traditionally extended into, I don't necessarily have the right to make treatment that is otherwise illegal, legal, because I want it for my child. That is that area of law as to what extent do my parental rights sort of trump determinations of the political branches of government regarding availability of medication. That arena has not been heavily litigated, Skye, but that argument dropped out. That argument was not part of this case at the Supreme Court. So it's really being based on, is this sex discrimination or not?
Are the plaintiffs making an argument that if this law is allowed to stand, it creates a precedent that could affect other forget transgender dynamics and issues in our culture, that this would set a precedent that could lead to other bad outcomes? Or is that not part of their argument?
Well, I think one of the things they're saying is that a precedent here could actually lead to an outcome where a state could ban any kind of trans medical intervention for minors or adults. So the argument is, well, wait a minute, if this is not sex-based discrimination, if this is just all subject to rational basis review, then why isn't it the case for adults as well? And if it's subject to rational basis review, in theory, a Tennessee or an Arkansas or an Alabama could ban, in essence, the argument would be like eradicate transgender identity in their state, right? And so the argument has been, well, wait a minute, your reasoning regarding this treatment, if you apply, it transfers for age as well. And the Tennessee's response is, no. This is an age-based distinction, not a sex-based distinction. Therefore, because it's age-based and not sex-based, it's subject to rational basis review. And so there's a big argument in the court as to, is this an age restriction or is this a sex restriction?
Okay, but going back to your hypothetical about the acne medication being applied to rheumatoid arthritis, rational basis review of that has nothing to do with age or sex or gender or anything like that. It's just the medical establishment is suspicious of the effectiveness or outcome of using this treatment or drug, and therefore the courts go, okay. So if the medical establishment were to come out with some data that questioned the efficacy of medical or hormonal transitioning even for adults, wouldn't that open the door to banning these things for adults as well?
Well, the answer to that is your argument about sex-based discrimination is stronger if you're talking about a blanket ban from children to adults than if you're only talking about children. Okay, so if the question is, what standard of review do we use? An age-based restriction, as it traditionally is going to result in this rational basis standard review. A sex-based distinction is not. The sex-based distinction is higher levels of scrutiny. And so you have a lot stronger argument that you have a sex-based distinction when you're talking about for all people from whatever age to 85, 90, whatever, that there are these sex-based distinctions in the way that hormones are prescribed. Now, there are responses to this that say, wait, even if it is sex-based, it can satisfy intermediate scrutiny, whatever. But let's just hang with me on, is this sex-based or not? That it's a much stronger argument that you've made a sex-based distinction if that distinction applies from, childhood through adulthood, versus in childhood, you have one standard that applies to you, and in adulthood, you have a second standard. In that circumstance, age is the salient characteristic, not sex.
Okay. You brought up a detail in your article that I didn't know because I don't live in Tennessee and I've never been in this situation, but Tennessee law prohibits a child from receiving a tattoo even with parental consent.
Yes.
And I assume the reason for that would be a tattoo is generally a permanent
Yes.
feature on their body. So I think most people, when they learn that, would go, well, of course, that's the state intervenes from bad parents doing
Yes.
stupid things and letting their kids do permanently stupid things and like a tattoo. And some of these treatments, whether surgical or hormonal, can have permanent effects.
Yes.
And the state is stepping in going, all right, even if a parent wants to do this, even if a child wants to do this, we're going to say, nah, because it could have a permanent impact for the life of that individual.
Yeah.
And they need to be an adult themselves to make this decision. It can't be done by the parent. The counter argument to that is some would say these treatments for kids who are struggling with their gender identity are potentially life-saving because of depression, anxiety, suicide among trans youth, things like that. And therefore, for the state to say you can't have this, it isn't like my child's life depends on whether or not they can get this tattoo.
Right.
And some people would argue my child's life depends on whether or not we can have these treatments. And the state is telling me no, and that's going too far. Counterpoint.
Yeah. So that's where that argument has lost a lot of its force after something called the Cass Review out of Britain. So in essence, what happened, and I'm sure there are listeners who are more expert in this, but let me just give a brief summary of what happened. Is you had this so-called Dutch protocol that sprang up a few years ago for treatment of transgender youth, which was early medical intervention. It was based on a very, very, very limited study, but it spread like wildfire in sort of the developed world, that the way you deal with youth gender confusion, youth gender dysphoria, is sometimes it was often called by hitting a pause button, for example, on puberty. You just pause puberty so people can work it out, or delivery of cross-sex hormones. And a lot of the reasoning was, well, and this sounds awful, but this is like kind of the way some of the argument went to parents is, do you want if you have a daughter who has gender dysphoria and you don't want to give the cross-sex hormones, you don't want to do puberty blockers, you don't want to do top surgery or whatever, do you want a dead girl or a live boy?
Yeah.
And so for a long time, there was this sort of consensus that A, these treatments were very effective, and B, they were life-saving because they prevented suicide. So the Cass Review takes a look at studies, practices, not just in Great Britain, but in the developed world, and finds that, no, wait a minute, actually this kind of Dutch protocol does not change suicide rates. It doesn't. And in fact, a lot of the effectiveness is unproven. Like this sort of consensus that these treatments are effective is just dissolved. It's the treatments are unproven. There are side effects that can be lifelong. And by the way, it is not actually life-saving because there isn't that distinction in suicide rate. And in fact, this was a very important point, a moment in the oral argument in the case, because Chase Strangio, who is one of the advocates for the trans plaintiffs, was essentially confronted over the suicide rate and was acknowledging, no, that there isn't the evidence that the suicide rate is different, but then made a different argument that maybe suicidal ideation or suicidality is less frequent if you have the treatment, but not that suicide is less frequent. And so a lot has changed in the last year around this concept of medical consensus, to the point where in some of the countries in Europe that had been trailblazing early medical intervention for transgender youth, we're now pulling back dramatically, in some cases banning it except for research purposes.
Yeah. In your piece, you quote Dr. Hilary Cass, who led this research project for the National Health Service in the UK. And her conclusion, this is the quote, "The reality is that we have no good evidence on the long-term outcomes of interventions to manage gender-related distress."
Yeah.
Take the politics out of this, take the ideology out of this, and just look at the science. I think the fairest thing to say is it's too soon. We don't know what the best way to deal with this is. And it's going to take a while before we have better conclusions. So to kind of tilt the scale toward the Tennessee law, Tennessee seems to be saying the science is unclear. The medical establishment is, there's no consensus around this. And the potential negative outcomes lifelong for children are too severe that we're just going to say, we're not going to do this.
Right. And, I would say before the Cass review came out, if this case came up before the Supreme Court, it would have passed rational basis review even before the Cass report. Mm-hmm. So because rational basis review is just a very easy thing for governments to pass. I mean, it gives governments broad discretion. So before the Cass report, this would have passed rational basis review. After the Cass review, or Cass report, I think the Tennessee ban may even pass intermediate scrutiny. In other words, the court could say, okay, we'll grant you, plaintiffs, that this is focused on sex, that this is a sex-related distinction. That means we apply a heightened level of scrutiny to the law, not the most high level, but a heightened level. And with the results of the Cass review, I think it would even pass intermediate scrutiny, Skye. So the knowledge of side effects combined with increasing knowledge of lack of effectiveness on the intended purpose means that the rationale behind the ban is only being bolstered currently, not undermined. And then there's this last thing where the Supreme Court has really been trending towards deferring to democracy when fundamental rights aren't at stake. It's really been sort of sending this message. We want the elected branches to have full authority, exercise their full constitutional authority. You got around 24 states that have passed these laws. There's going to be sort of a natural deference to the democratic process here as well. But honestly, I think, Skye, it's really fascinating to watch how debates evolve while multi-year cases play out.
Yeah.
The debate has changed on this.
Yeah. Of the 24 states that have passed these kinds of laws, are they all red states?
I believe they're all red states.
Yeah. And that's the part that I think I find disheartening about this issue has become so politicized and partisan rather than rooted in science or medicine. And that's unfortunate. Okay. Last question on this. Do you have a sense, or have you and Sarah talked about it enough to predict how the court's going to come out on this? And when might we expect a decision? Yeah,
that's another great question. So here's the caveat. Litigators will say, don't read too much into oral argument, because they'll offer that as the standard disclaimer. It's sort of like in securities law, how someone will say, past performance is no indicator of future results, but everyone selects like their investment manager based on past performance anyway. It's similarly with evaluating court cases. Every lawyer will say, don't read too much into oral argument, and then they'll proceed to read everything into oral argument. But with that standard caveat, at oral argument, it appeared that 5 justices were friendly to the Tennessee law. 1 justice was totally silent, Justice Gorsuch, which was interesting. And 3 justices, the 3 Democratic nominees, seemed to be quite hostile to the Tennessee law. So just doing math, that's 5, 3, and 1. So even if Justice Gorsuch sides with the 3 Democratic nominees, that's 5-4 for the Tennessee law, with all the warnings and caveats that might not be right. Because I did not see any indication from oral argument that the 5 really were wavering all that much on this. And in fact, I don't see much indication from their prior jurisprudence that they would overturn the Tennessee law here. Justice Gorsuch is a little bit different. I think Justice Gorsuch might be more influenced to adopt the sex discrimination reasoning. He was instrumental in the Bostock decision, which used a very similar frame. But even then, I do wonder if he would say it passes that intermediate scrutiny. It really is hard to, as somebody who's followed and participated in this debate, really since its inception, it's kind of hard to overstate how different the cultural temperature is around this. There are passions that are very high on both sides, but there is an absolute willingness to have a conversation and to question sort of a lot of the rush to treatment consensus than there was even 2 years ago or a year ago.
Yeah, I'd love to live with the illusion that the court is immune to those cultural temperatures.
I know.
There's a reason
hot.
they're appointed. There's a reason they're appointed for life, and they wear black robes. And they, all that is to say, we are not susceptible to the whims of. We just rule based on the law. And I know that's naive, but I'd like to. When might we get a ruling? Do you think?
Oh yes, probably at the end of June. I mean, it's you.
It's
you
gonna
hate
be a
to,
while.
Yeah, you hate to say this because. I mean, they had the argument in December, early December, and are we really going to wait 7 months? Yeah, probably. I mean, and it's not necessarily because the court just is wanting to make us wait. It's that, the general rule is that the court issues decisions when they're ready, and the big culture war cases tend to be, sort of picked over more, for lack of a better. In other words, that there's longer decisions, longer opinions. They take more time. You have multiple dissents and concurrences that require responses. And so you just have a process where, the opinions and different opinions are being handed back and forth in chambers in a way that like a decision about employee benefits or, like burdens of proof and securities litigation doesn't quite generate the same kind. And often those more mundane cases have unanimous results. I don't think this one will have a unanimous result. So,
as I said at the beginning, this topic is so full of landmines. We got to navigate carefully, and the court knows that too. And so they're gonna take their time. And
one thing that I wish is that there is this issue is a horseshoe theory issue, not in outcome but in tactics. And by that I mean, so you have the far right and the far left. The far left is, as we've seen, absolutely committed to interventions early as parents and providers dictate if the child wishes it, and then turns around and treats critics as if they're just demonic. Right. And then the far right essentially is saying, no, we want to sort of extinguish the entire concept of a transgender person at all. And that means using the law as a weapon to do so. And also absolutely treats any critics as essentially demonic. Any disagreement is essentially demonic. And so you have this real horseshoe theory and tactics where the far right and the far left are not just entrenched in their position, but they treat any disagreement as evil, right? And so there's a center right and a center left, though, that's long on this issue been much more, say, confused than activated, and very repelled and repulsed by the intolerance of the conversation.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really, really important that we be able to have a conversation about this case where we distinguish between medical arguments and legal arguments, constitutional arguments and statutory arguments. All of this is complicated. It is complicated. And there are ramifications from going in either direction here that I think a lot of the hyper-partisans have not fully thought through.
Yeah, well, the hyper-partisans are not known for their humility. So
no.
Okay, last thing before we wrap up, we should have a little nerd moment.
Of course.
As this is our last time recording this year. We are recording this on December 20th, just before the holidays. And yesterday, the trailer for the new Superman movie, written and directed by James Gunn, came out. The movie comes out July 11th, I think. You love superhero movies, so do I. You were a fan of the prior Superman iteration, the Zack Snyder Superman.
Loved it. Man of Steel. So underrated.
And all of the Justice League stuff that he did.
Yeah.
What did you think of the James Gunn take on Superman, at least what we've seen so far? Because it looks very, very different. Very,
very different. Like, I love the Zack Snyder take, not because I think it is the Superman take, but because I thought it was a fresh, interesting, and I love the whole Zack Snyder sort of approach to superhero movies, which Sonny Bunch, my pop culture guru from The Bulwark, described as, let's just sort of take the premise seriously. What if the, quote, small g gods were real? Like, what would that look like in a culture and everything? So it makes his version of everything a little darker.
A little darker.
A lot darker.
It's a lot darker.
It's grim.
It's depressing, and Superman is brooding the whole time. And do I want to do this? And the world hates me. And it's very.
He made Superman human. He made him human. But anyway, but that's not the only take on. I also loved the Christopher Reeve I mean, loved him.
Yes.
And so I will say this was a Christopher Reeve style Superman trailer. And you could tell that from the first few seconds when you heard the John Williams Superman score.
Yeah.
And
Though with an electric guitar this time.
With an electric, and all I have to say is, you play me 3 seconds of that John Williams score, I'm in.
Yeah.
I'm in. I don't care if Crypto, the superhero dog, is a little cheesy. I don't care, if it's sort of a very different vision. Obviously, you can see that it is just from the color palette of the actual trailer itself. Zack Snyder, it feels like everything takes place at about 6:30 p.m. on a rainy day. This was like bright sunlight, bright colors, much more like that sort of old school comic book vision of Superman. And I'm here for that too, Skye. I am promiscuous in my love for superhero movies. And so I like different visions.
Yeah, I agree with you. There were things about the Zack Snyder Superman, Man of Steel that I liked, but overall, I felt like it didn't match the character. They kind of turned Superman into Batman. They took the darkness and the success of the Dark Knight, Christopher Nolan series, and go, let's do that to Superman now. I'm like, it's not the right tone for Superman. And I always preferred the Christopher Reeve, at least the original 1978 Superman and maybe Superman 2, the Richard Donner versions of Superman, which were brighter, more hopeful, more optimistic. And James Gunn certainly has that. And I don't know if you've read any of his interviews recently, but he's talked about how he sees this new Superman movie as, this is my language, but sort of a parable for America right now. And the trailer opens up with Superman beaten and bloodied, laying in the snow and wheezing because he's in such bad shape. And says to the dog, take me home. And he basically said, this is America right now. We're beaten up and bloodied. But he said this movie is supposed to represent the fundamental goodness and kindness of the American people.
Oh, love that.
And so his hope for this movie is that it reinvigorates that vision of who we are as a people, which is really welcome it. And so I love the brightness of it. I love the suit. I think that the whole thing just looks so much more comic booky and hopeful and all that. The one concern I have is, maybe you hinted at this, is he's introducing a lot more of the comic book elements of Superman, from the giant kaiju creature, looks like almost like a dinosaur Godzilla-like creature that he's fighting, to Crypto, the super dog, to all the other superheroes that are depicted in the trailer. I'm like, is it going to be too campy? Is it going to over-index on the bright side in a way that Zack Snyder, I think, over-indexed on the doom and gloom side?
Well, that's where we're going to get to a concept that we talked about just a few minutes ago. Is past performance indicative of future results? And I've just got a lot of trust in James Gunn.
I do too.
I think he's just really good at what he does. I've enjoyed all of his superhero movies. And yeah, I would have a little bit of that same concern, but also what you were saying about how he thinks, hey, for this moment, that kind of Christopher Reeve style Superman, it's right. It seems right. And going back to that Christopher Reeve, to me, this early Superman series ended after Superman 2. Like when you got into this quest for peace and all of that.
3 and 4 were terrible.
Yeah, but Superman 1 and 2 were phenomenal. And they pulled it off, the sort of optimistic, hopeful, cheesy Clark Kent character in a way, because I think it's harder to pull off hopeful than dark.
Absolutely.
But they did it. I mean, those movies did it. And it's fascinating to me how much, not only did those movies do it, but the movies turned Christopher Reeve himself into like a symbol, which, when he had his horrible accident and, became quadriplegic and everything, it's interesting how much his response to that as quote unquote Superman, and how courageously he approached all of that, had this incredible lasting effect. There was this recent documentary that even the trailer makes me like weep.
Did you see it?
I haven't seen it yet.
I just watched it this weekend. It's beautiful. It's painful. Part of me felt like it should have been called, the documentary is called Superman, Super/Man.
Yeah.
I almost felt like it should have been called Superwoman, because his wife, Dana Reeve, just was incredible in what she did and how she managed him and the family and all that tragedy. And then, spoiler alert, but he passed away in 2004. And shortly afterwards, she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and she died less than 2 years after
Unbelievable.
her husband. And
Yeah.
they had a teenage son at the time who is now an adult. But like, it's just also a reminder that fame and celebrity is no shield against pain and trauma and,
isn't that the truth?
heartache.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's a beautiful documentary. I really recommend it. But go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
but it's amazing to me how much the movie, this role that he plays, set up who he was in real life.
Yeah.
In such a powerfully virtuous and courageous and beautiful way. So, you know, I'm a big believer in the power of art, even superhero art, maybe especially superhero art, but even superhero art to actually have a meaningful impact on people's hearts.
Yeah, we'll have another geek out nerd episode maybe next year, but I'd love to talk. I heard this podcast recently where they were talking about the beginning of the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the mid 2000s and how some of that, especially Iron Man, reflected that era in the midst of the war on terrorism, post 9/11, all that, and that maybe this beginning of this new DC Cinematic Universe that James Gunn is launching might reflect our times.
Yeah.
In its tone and tenor and the values of the characters that get presented. And I think that'd be interesting to look at American culture and society and politics and history through the lens of these art forms and what they mean. But
oh yeah, absolutely.
It'll be fun to talk to you about in 2025. David, have a wonderful Christmas. Hope you enjoy your family, and we'll talk again real soon.
Merry Christmas, Skye. Enjoyed the conversation as always.
French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Skye Jatani. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.